The world knows Cleetus McFarland as the fearless king of horsepower, a loud, confident entertainer who lives for speed, smoke, and spectacle. What most people never saw, however, was how close the man behind the character, Garrett Mitchell, came to losing absolutely everything. Nearly $1 million disappeared into a racetrack that was falling apart. A fan was permanently injured during a burnout show. Lawsuits followed. Then one day, federal agents showed up at his door. Beneath a wild personality and endless jokes was a man drowning in fear, pressure, and heartbreak. This story reveals the emotional truth behind the scenes, showing how the dream of the Freedom Factory nearly destroyed him. From financial collapse and crushing debt to lawsuits, crashes, investigations, and relentless stress, every setback pushed Garrett to the edge. In the end, those same struggles would also shape the redemption that followed. When Garrett Mitchell first stepped onto the cracked pavement of the abandoned DeSoto Speedway in early 2020, he didn't focus on the weeds growing through the asphalt, the broken fencing, or the rust slowly consuming the forgotten oval. He saw something entirely different. He saw a dream. In his mind, this place was not a decaying relic. It was the birthplace of something bold, loud, and life-changing. Where others saw a ghost town that should have been demolished, Garrett saw opportunity. He imagined the Freedom Factory, a space where he could build outrageous machines, host massive events, and film content no one else dared to attempt. It was a vision fueled by passion and confidence. But dreams of that size never come cheaply. The price tag was staggering, $850,000. It was far more money than Garrett had ever risked before, and it should have been enough to scare anyone away. Instead of backing down, he pushed everything he owned onto the table. He drained savings accounts he had quietly built over more than a decade. He sold personal vehicles, tools, and equipment that held deep sentimental value. He opened new lines of credit and maxed out the ones he already had. This was not a carefully calculated business decision. It was a raw, emotional, gamble-driven, by faith, adrenaline, and the belief that if anyone could revive a dead racetrack, it was him. When he signed the contract, he smiled for the camera and acted like it was the greatest day of his life. Deep inside, though he knew he had crossed a line he could never undo, what Garrett didn't know was that the world was about to shut down. Within weeks, the global pandemic hit with full force. Events he had planned were suddenly illegal. Grants had to remain empty. And a racetrack without events brings in no income at all. Almost overnight, the Freedom Factory became a sinking ship, and Garrett was the only one trying to keep it afloat. That was not an exaggeration. Crew members often found him alone on the property, sleeping in the infield, hammering loose boards, cutting back weeds, and editing videos inside a tiny trailer. There were no cheering crowds, no roaring burnout pits, and no sponsors rushing in to help. It was just Garrett, a decaying track, and a growing pile of bills. Property taxes demanded payment without mercy. Insurance costs for a facility that the size were brutal. Payroll still had to be met, no matter how video was performed. Every morning brought a new expense he couldn't escape, and every night ended with the same question echoing in his mind. Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? The man who shouted about freedom now felt trapped inside a tightening chain of debt, and as overwhelming as the financial pressure was, it turned out to be only the first blow. Something far more frightening was already on the way, carrying the full authority of the federal government. As the months dragged on, the pressure surrounding Garrett Mitchell grew heavier by the day. Empty grandstands haunted him every time he walked across the cracked pavement. Bills piled up faster than he could deal with them. Property taxes, rising insurance rates, and basic utility costs crushed any sense of momentum. What was about to be the birth of a dream began to feel like its slow and painful death. Then came the financial mistake that pushed everything into real danger. One morning, after another exhausting night spent editing videos, Garrett received a phone call he would never forget. It was the Internal Revenue Service. His quarterly tax payment had bounced. Without realizing it, he had overdrawn his account. For most people, a bounced check might be an inconvenience. When that check belongs to the federal government, it becomes a serious threat. The IRS does not overlook mistakes. They investigate, impose penalties, charge interest, and can seize assets. As the agent explained the situation, Garrett felt his heart sink later. He admitted his hands were shaking during the call. In that moment, the Cleetus McFarland persona disappeared, leaving only Garrett a stressed, exhausted young man desperately trying to hold a collapsing business together. He had poured everything into the racetrack, expecting to recover the investment through events, sponsorships, and content creation. Instead, he watched money vanish before he ever had a chance to earn it. Every new video felt like a desperate attempt to plug another leak in a sinking ship, and YouTube offered no relief. As the pandemic spread, advertisers pulled back, and the platform favored softer, safer content over burnout pits and race cars. Revenue dropped sharply. Garrett worked twice as hard for half the income, filming all day, fixing broken equipment in the afternoon, and editing until sunrise. Fronts noticed the toll. He looked thinner, more distant, lost inside his own thoughts. He smoked more, slept less, and second-guessed every decision. Every missed payment felt like a ticking clock. Every letter from the IRS reminded him that one wrong move could cost him the Freedom Factory, his channel, and everything he had built. The stress was overwhelming, and the worst was still ahead. Before Garrett could even catch his breath, tragedy struck during one of the first major comeback events. A freak accident in the burnout pit would leave a fan scarred for life. The Freedom Factory was meant to be Cleetus's ultimate triumph, a place where smoke, engines, and chaos blended into a carefully controlled spectacle. Instead, the burnout pit became the darkest chapter of his career. What began as a high-energy crowd favorite spiraled into an accident that would haunt Garrett for years. It happened fast, violently, and without warning. No matter how many times he replayed the footage, he couldn't escape the feeling that he should have seen it coming. On a blistering summer day, the pit overflowed with energy. Fans pressed against safety rails, phones raised, cheering as cars shredded tires into massive clouds of white smoke. The noise, heat, and vibration created a pressure cooker of adrenaline. Drivers pushed harder and faster, and Garrett encouraged the intensity, trusting that everyone understood their limits. In reality, no one truly knew where those limits were until they were crossed. The smoke became so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Spectators couldn't see where the cars were or how close danger really was. A driver, blinded and overwhelmed, lost control. In seconds, the car snapped sideways, jumped the concrete edge, and slammed into the barrier, where fans leaned forward for a better view. Screams replaced cheers. Chaos erupted. Garrett's heart stopped as he ran toward the scene. Convinced for one horrifying moment that someone had died, the aftermath was devastating. A young fan collapsed with a spinal injury. Another suffered severe burns from flying debris and scalding tire fragments. Paramedics rushed in as cameras captured the horror. What had felt like a celebration now resembled a crime scene Garrett never intended to create. The lawsuit followed quickly. The injured fan's family accused Garrett of negligence, inadequate safety barriers, and poor event control. Lawyers demanded answers. Reporters swarmed. Insurance companies panicked. Fans who once idolized Cleetus flooded comment sections with anger and blame. But worse than the legal threats was Garrett's guilt. It was raw and suffocating. Night after night, he replayed the screams in his head, questioning whether his obsession with pushing limits had finally gone too far. Even at his lowest point, Garrett refused to run. He rebuilt the burnout pit from the ground up, invested heavily in advanced safety systems, and met privately with the injured fan's family. Redemption couldn't erase what happened, but it would define what came next. The disaster permanently changed him, reshaping how he viewed risk, responsibility, and the true cost of entertainment. And while he worked to protect others, danger still followed him. The next disaster wouldn't happen in the stands. It would send him flying through the air at nearly 200 miles per hour. The crash did not begin with a simple error or a careless slip. It began with confidence, deep, hardened confidence. The kind of confidence that forms after hundreds of successful passes, thousands of hard launches, and years of convincing yourself that raw power and determination can force you through any situation if you just give it enough throttle. This was supposed to be another thrilling run for the fans. Another unforgettable moment where Garrett Mitchell proved he could push a car to its absolute limit without crossing the point of no return. But on that particular day, the boundary shifted without warning, and he didn't realize it until it was already too late. The car itself was a violent, brutally powerful machine, barely predictable on its best days. Even before the run began, it was fighting him. The track temperature was climbing, the tires were moody and unreliable, and the tune was far more aggressive than he had admitted to anyone. Still, Garrett brushed off every warning sign. He had driven in worse conditions. He had wrestled with even sketchier setups before, and the crowd was there, buzzing with excitement. The cameras were rolling. That combination had always pushed him to perform, even when his instincts quietly told him to be careful. The instant he launched, something felt wrong. The rear tires grabbed harder than expected, twisting the chassis violently as the steering wheel snapped in his hands. Instead of lifting, he reacted on instinct. He corrected, pedaled the throttle, and stayed in it. That response didn't come from a mindset of survival. It came from the instincts of an entertainer. Within moments, the car broke loose, snapping sideways and hurtling toward the wall. Everything became noise, wind, and unstoppable momentum as the vehicle lifted, slammed down, and tumbled through a storm of torn metal and shattered fiberglass. When the wreck finally came to rest, the silence was almost worse than the impact. Smoke hissed from the engine bay. Fuel dripped onto the track. Pieces of debris continued to fall around him. His ears rang as if he were submerged underwater. Pain shot through his ribs, spine, and neck. Breathing felt nearly impossible, as though the air had been crushed out of his chest along with the front of the car. The roll cage, built for moments exactly like this, was the sole reason he was still alive. Rescue crews rushed across the track while the crowd watched in stunned horror. Some fans cried. Some prayed. Others pulled out their phones, unsure how else to react. Trapped inside the twisted wreckage, Garrett wasn't thinking about racing at all. His thoughts went to his family, his team, and the terrifying question of whether this was the moment he had finally gone too far. When the crews pried open the door and helped him climb out, reality hit hard. His body shook uncontrollably. From pain, but from the realization that he had come within inches of an impact that could have ended his career or his life. The crash wasn't just brutal, it was humbling. Doctors ordered him to rest. Fans begged him to slow down. His team questioned whether events at the Freedom Factory should be paused. But the most important shift happened internally. For the first time in years, Garrett questioned the identity he had, built a fearless daredevil who laughed in the face of danger. The crash didn't destroy him, but it forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for a long time. Even heroes break. And sometimes the most valuable skill isn't powering through chaos. It's knowing when to lift. Grounded by the Fahoon, Garrett heard the knock at the door. He assumed it was something routine, a delivery, or maybe a fan dropping something off for the Freedom Factory staff. Instead, he opened the door to find two officials standing there, expressionless, badges in hand, asking for him by name. They were from the FAA, and they were not there for a casual conversation. Their visit was triggered by one video, one flight, and one moment that spread across the internet for all the wrong reasons. In that instant, Garrett realized that the chaos he usually controlled on the racetrack had followed him into the sky. What started as a seemingly harmless stunt, a small plane, a few cameras, and a short flight filmed for content, had crossed into dangerous territory. Garrett loved flying almost as much as he loved horsepower, and he approached aviation with the same excitement and thrill-seeking mindset. But flying is not racing. There are no last-second corrections at 3,000 feet, no improvisation, no brushing off a mistake with a laugh. The FAA had seen something in the footage, something they considered a serious violation, and they treated it accordingly. The officials asked direct, pointed questions. Who was piloting the aircraft? What instructions were given? Why was the maneuver performed at such a low altitude? Did he understand the regulations that may have been ignored? Their tone made it clear this wasn't speculation. They had analyzed the footage repeatedly, slowing it down, reviewing every angle. This was an investigation. Garrett felt trapped not because he intended to break rules, but because the world he lived in, where every moment became content, clashed violently with the rigid, unforgiving nature of aviation law. He tried to explain the context and the safety precautions he believed were in place, but intention didn't matter. Facts, documentation, and compliance were all that counted. Days later, official letters arrived, formal notices, potential penalties, threats of suspension. His pilot's license, one of the few escapes that gave him peace away from engines and noise, was suddenly at risk. And for the first time, he realized the FAA had the authority to silence him in a way no algorithm or platform ever could. Being grounded wasn't just a bureaucratic punishment, it was deeply emotional. Flying had become his rare moment of calm, an escape from the pressure of running the Freedom Factory, managing a team, and carrying the expectations of millions. Losing that freedom, even temporarily, hurt more than he admitted publicly. But the experience delivered a powerful lesson. Aviation demanded discipline, humility, and absolute respect for the rules. As Garrett reflected on the investigation, he knew he had to decide whether flying was just entertainment, or something that required a far more serious approach. What he didn't yet realize was that an even deeper emotional reckoning was waiting just ahead. As everything around him seemed to collapse, the lawsuits, the crashes, the investigations, and the crushing pressure, Garrett did something unexpected. Instead of chasing bigger stunts or louder victories, he stepped back and searched for a way to rebuild himself from the inside out. That moment arrived quietly during a visit to a local veterans event. He attended with simple intentions: show up, shake hands, take a few photos, and leave. But what he encountered instead were people who understood fear, loss, and responsibility on a level far beyond anything he had experienced. Listening to their stories reshaped his perspective. Compared to their sacrifices, his own chaos felt small. These men and women had faced real danger, permanent loss, and lasting consequences. Some had lost friends. Others had lost their health. Many carried invisible battles long after their service ended. Yet their strength wasn't loud or flashy. It was steady, humble, and deeply rooted. Something shifted inside him. He didn't want to entertain them anymore. He wanted to serve them. That single afternoon became a mission. Garrett began dedicating Freedom Factory events to veterans. He used his platform to support military families, hosting charity races, fundraisers, and tribute nights. Every handshake, every check handed over, felt like another piece of himself being repaired. Service wasn't performative, it was healing. The defining moment came during a private conversation with a veteran who had been struggling in silence. The man told Garrett that his video simper racing clips, filmed under the Florida sun, were sometimes the only thing that pulled him out of dark thoughts. Garrett wasn't ready for that level of honesty. It broke him open. He finally understood that he wasn't just creating content. He was giving people escape, connection, and hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt a purpose that didn't depend on views, money, or adrenaline. That purpose helped him slow down. It helped rebuild trust with his team. It reminded him that the world was larger than engines and racetracks. Service grounded him through recovery, humbled him during the FAA ordeal, and strengthened him after the crash that nearly ended everything. Service didn't erase the mistakes or the fear, but it gave him a path forward, a way to redefine what it meant to be Cleetus without losing the man behind the character. And as he stepped into this new role, the emotional cost he had avoided for years was finally ready to demand answers. What made this chapter of Garrett's life so powerful was not that he had finally found success or stability, but that he had found accountability. For years, momentum had carried him forward. Wins, views, applause, and adrenaline masking the emotional weight he never stopped to examine. The crash, the FAA investigation, and the sudden stillness that followed stripped away the noise. What remained was a man forced to sit with himself. Without an engine running to drown out the questions, he began to understand that confidence, when left unchecked, can quietly turn into blindness. The same mindset that helped him conquer racetracks had nearly cost him everything when applied without restraint elsewhere. Racing taught him how to push limits. Life was teaching him how to respect them. That distinction became impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, conversations grew more honest. With his team, with his family, with himself. Decisions were no longer about what would generate the biggest reaction online, but what would still make sense years from now. He didn't stop being bold, but he became intentional. The laughter remained, the passion stayed alive, but it was no longer fueled by recklessness. Fans began to notice the shift, not because the content disappeared, but because it matured. There was more purpose behind the chaos, more meaning behind the spectacle. The Freedom Factory wasn't just a place for speed anymore, it became a place for community, for remembrance, for giving back. The track that once symbolized pure adrenaline started to represent growth. Garrett didn't pretend the fear was gone. He admitted that some nights the crash replayed in his mind, frame by frame, the sound of metal tearing, the silence afterward, the realization of how close it had all come to ending. But instead of running from those memories, he learned to listen to them. Fear, he realized, wasn't weakness, it was information. The same was true of humility. Being grounded by the FAA hurt his pride, but it also reminded him that not every system bends to confidence. Some demand respect, patience, and responsibility above all else. Accepting that didn't diminish him and refined him. And through service, through showing up when no cameras were required, he found something unexpected. Peace. Not the absence of pressure, but the presence of meaning. Helping others gave weight to his platform in a way no stunt ever could. It reminded him that influence isn't measured by noise, but by impact. This wasn't a redemption story wrapped up neatly with a bow. It was ongoing, messy, human. Garrett Mitchell didn't become perfect, and he never claimed to be. What changed was his willingness to grow publicly instead of just performing publicly. Though crash didn't define him, the investigation didn't destroy him, and the fear didn't stop him. What mattered was what came after, the choice to slow down, to serve, and to redefine success on his own terms. And that's the part of the story most people miss. Because sometimes the most important transformation doesn't happen at full throttle. Sometimes it happens in the silence after the wreck, in the grounding that forces reflection, and in the quiet decision to become better than you were yesterday.